Sarah Mitchell stood at the kitchen window of her small apartment, watching the rain streak down the glass like the tears she refused to shed anymore. At 38, she had grown tired of explaining herself to relatives who measured a woman's worth by the children she bore. The latest family gathering had been particularly brutal, with Aunt Helen's pointed comments about her empty nest and Cousin Margaret's pitying glances across the dinner table. "Maybe if you tried harder," her sister Linda had whispered during dessert, gesturing toward Sarah's simple dress and pulled-back hair. "Men want someone who makes an effort." Sarah had smiled politely and excused herself early, driving the 40 minutes back to her quiet life in the small town of Cedar Falls. She worked as a librarian at the local elementary school. Surrounded by other people's children all day, coming home to silence that her family seemed to think was tragic. But Sarah had made peace with her solitude years ago, or so she told herself. The phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. Her mother's voice came through the speaker with that familiar tone of forced cheerfulness that meant bad news was coming. "Sarah, honey, I have wonderful news. Your cousin Beth is getting married next month, and she's asked all the family to come to Colorado for the wedding. It'll be at some beautiful ranch resort. Won't that be lovely?" Sarah closed her eyes. Another wedding. Another opportunity for relatives to ask when it would be her turn, to speculate about what was wrong with her. "That sounds nice, Mom. I'll check my calendar." "Oh, you simply must come. Beth specifically asked about you. She's so excited to share her happiness with the whole family." The guilt was expertly applied, as always. Sarah's mother had perfected the art of making declining family events seem like a personal betrayal. "I'll do my best to make it work." After hanging up, Sarah sat in her favorite armchair with a cup of tea, considering her options. She could make an excuse and skip the wedding, dealing with months of disappointed phone calls and concerned texts. Or she could go, endure 3 days of subtle and not-so-subtle commentary about her single status, and return home emotionally drained but having fulfilled her family obligations. A third option occurred to her as she browsed travel websites that evening. The wedding was at the Lone Star Guest Ranch, a working cattle ranch that offered accommodations for events. The website showed vast landscapes, horses grazing in green pastures, and testimonials from guests who talked about the peace they'd found in the wide-open spaces. Sarah made an impulsive decision that surprised even her. She would arrive a week early. The family would think she was being excessive, but Sarah didn't care. She needed time to prepare herself mentally for the onslaught of questions and comments. More than that, she found herself genuinely curious about ranch life. She'd grown up in suburban Chicago, never spending significant time in rural areas. The idea of wide skies and actual quiet appealed to her in a way she hadn't expected. 3 weeks later, Sarah's rental car bumped along the gravel road leading to Lone Star Guest Ranch. The landscape stretched endlessly in all directions. Rolling hills covered in grass that moved like water in the wind. She'd never seen so much sky at once, pale blue and cloudless, making her feel both insignificant and somehow more real than she had in years. The ranch buildings came into view gradually, weathered wood and stone structures that looked like they'd grown from the earth itself. The main lodge was larger than she'd expected, with a wraparound porch and rocking chairs that invited lingering. Horse paddocks and pastures stretched in all directions, and she could see cattle dotting the distant hills like dark specks. Sarah parked near the lodge and stepped out of her car, immediately struck by the silence. Not the absent sound of her apartment, but a different kind of quiet filled with subtle life. Wind through grass, the distant lowing of cattle, birds she couldn't identify. She breathed deeply, tasting dust and something green and growing. "You must be Sarah Mitchell." She turned to find a man approaching from the direction of the barn, wiping his hands on a rag tucked into his belt. He was tall and lean, with dark hair streaked with early gray, and lines around his eyes that spoke of years spent squinting into sun and wind. His smile was genuine and unhurried, the kind of expression Sarah rarely saw in her daily life. "I'm Jake Thompson. Welcome to Lone Star." His handshake was firm and warm, calloused hands that spoke of real work. Sarah found herself studying his face, struck by how present he seemed, how focused on this moment rather than already thinking ahead to the next task. "Thank you. It's beautiful here, much bigger than I expected. Wait until you see it at sunset. That's when the place really shows off." Jake gestured toward her luggage. "Let me help you get settled. Emma's got your cabin ready and she's been cooking all day in case you were hungry from the drive." As they walked toward a cluster of smaller buildings behind the lodge, Jake kept up an easy conversation. He asked about her trip, her first impressions of the area, whether she'd ever spent time on a ranch before. His questions felt genuine rather than polite, and Sarah found herself responding more openly than usual. "Never been on a ranch," she admitted. "I'm not even sure I know the difference between a cow and a steer." Jake laughed, a rich sound that seemed to come from somewhere deep in his chest. "Well, we've got a week to fix that, if you're interested in learning, that is. Some folks come here just to sit on the porch and read. I think I'd like to learn." The words surprised Sarah as much as they seemed to please Jake. "Good. We'll start tomorrow morning if you're up for it. Early, though. Ranch work begins before the sun's fully up." Sarah's cabin was perfect. Rustic, but comfortable with a stone fireplace and windows that looked out over the pastures. Jake helped carry her bags inside, pointing out amenities and explaining meal times. He moved with an easy competence that Sarah found unexpectedly attractive, the way he seemed to belong completely in this environment. "Emma's our cook and general manager," he was saying as he adjusted a window blind. "She runs the guest side of things while I handle the cattle and horses. You'll meet her at dinner. She's been looking forward to having someone to fuss over. It must be quiet here most of the time." "Peaceful," Jake corrected gently. "There's a difference. Quiet can feel empty, but peaceful feels full. You'll see what I mean after you've been here a few days." That evening, Sarah sat on her cabin's small porch, watching the sun set over the endless grassland. Jake had been right. This was when the land truly revealed itself. The sky turned brilliant orange and pink, colors so vivid they seemed impossible. The grass caught the light and glowed like spun gold, and the distant hills became purple silhouettes against the burning sky. For the first time in longer than she could remember, Sarah felt something loosen in her chest. Some knot of tension she'd grown so accustomed to carrying that she'd forgotten it was there. She thought about her family's upcoming questions, their concern that always felt more like judgment, and realized that here, surrounded by this vast landscape and genuine quiet, those worries seemed smaller somehow. A horse whinnied somewhere in the distance, and Sarah smiled. Tomorrow she would learn the difference between cows and steers. Tonight, she would simply sit and watch the stars emerge in numbers she'd never seen from her apartment in town. For the first time in years, she was exactly where she wanted to be, with no one asking her to explain or justify her choices. The peace Jake had promised was already beginning to work its way into her bones, and Sarah Mitchell, the woman her family pitied for her empty life, felt fuller than she had in decades. She couldn't know it yet, but this week would change everything she thought she knew about herself and what kind of love she deserved. The rancher who'd welcomed her with such easy warmth would soon show her that some people saw value in places others only saw absence, and that sometimes the most profound connections grew in the space of days rather than years. As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Sarah made herself a promise. Whatever happened during her family's visit next week, whatever comments or concerns they brought with them, she would remember this feeling. She would remember that she was complete exactly as she was. that her life had meaning and richness that couldn't be measured by conventional standards. The vast Montana sky seemed to stretch endlessly above her, full of possibilities she'd never dared to imagine. The next morning arrived with a soft knock on her cabin door just as the sky was beginning to lighten. Sarah had slept better than she had in months, lulled by the complete darkness and genuine quiet of the ranch. She opened the door to find Jake standing on her small porch, 2 steaming mugs of coffee in his hands. "Thought you might need this before we start," he said, offering her one of the mugs. "Ranch coffee's strong enough to wake the dead." Sarah wrapped her hands around the warm ceramic, inhaling the rich aroma. "How early is it?" 5:30. "I know it sounds brutal, but you'll understand once you see the sunrise from the pasture. Besides, the animals don't care what time humans think is reasonable." She'd packed jeans and boots, as the ranch's information packet had suggested, and Jake nodded approvingly at her practical outfit. "Good choice. You'll be grateful for sturdy clothes once we get out with the horses." As they walked toward the barn, Jake explained the ranch's operation. Lone Star ran about 200 head of cattle on 1,500 acres, plus a small herd of horses used both for ranch work and guest activities. He and his brother had inherited the place from their grandfather, but his brother had moved to Denver years ago, leaving Jake to manage the operation with help from a few part-time hands and Emma's organizational skills. "Doesn't sound like an easy life," Sarah observed, stepping carefully over the uneven ground. "Easy's overrated," Jake replied. "Satisfying matters more. When you work with the land and animals, you know at the end of each day that you've accomplished something real, built something, cared for something, made something better than it was." The barn was warm and dim, filled with the scent of hay and leather. Horses nickered softly in their stalls, and Sarah could hear the gentle sounds of large animals moving in the straw. Jake led her to a stall containing a gentle-eyed bay mare. "This is Luna. She's patient with beginners and has more sense than most people I know." "I should mention I've never really ridden before," Sarah said, suddenly nervous. "We'll start slow. Today's just about getting comfortable around the horses, learning how to handle them safely. Riding comes later, if you want to try it." Jake moved around Luna with practiced efficiency, showing Sarah how to approach the horse, how to let her smell his hands, where to touch her safely. His instructions were clear and patient, never making Sarah feel foolish for her inexperience. When he guided her hands to Luna's neck, showing her how to brush the mare's coat, his touch was gentle and brief, professional, but somehow intimate. "She likes you," Jake observed as Luna leaned into Sarah's brushing. "Horses are good judges of character." "How can you tell?" "See how she's relaxed. Her ears are forward. She's not shifting away from you. She knows you're nervous, but she trusts that you won't hurt her. That says something about who you are." Sarah felt an unexpected warmth at his words. When was the last time someone had seen something positive in her simply for being herself? Not for what she produced or accomplished. Not for filling a expected role, but just for her essential character. They spent the morning working with the horses, and Sarah found herself surprisingly comfortable in the barn environment. The work was physical and immediate, requiring her full attention in a way that pushed all other concerns from her mind. When Jake taught her to lead Luna around the paddock, she felt a quiet pride in the horse's trust. "You're a natural," Jake said as they returned Luna to her stall. "Most people take longer to develop that kind of connection. It feels different than I expected. Calmer somehow. Animals live in the present. When you're working with them, you have to be present too. No point worrying about yesterday or tomorrow when you've got a 1,200-pound horse depending on you to pay attention right now." They walked back toward the lodge for lunch, and Sarah realized she felt more relaxed than she had in months. The physical work, the cool morning air, Jake's easy companionship. All of it combined to create a sense of rightness she couldn't remember experiencing before. "What made you decide to come early?" Jake asked as they climbed the porch steps. Sarah considered the question. "Honestly, I needed time to prepare myself for my family. They have opinions about how I live my life." Jake paused at the door, studying her face with those perceptive eyes. "What kind of opinions? The kind that come from people who think there's only one right way to be happy." Sarah surprised herself with her honesty. "Sounds exhausting." "It is." Jake held the door open for her, and as she passed him, he spoke quietly. "For what it's worth, you seem pretty happy to me this morning. Maybe they're measuring the wrong things." Inside the lodge, Sarah met Emma, a woman in her 60s with silver hair and a maternal warmth that immediately put visitors at ease. She fussed over Sarah's breakfast, asking about her morning with the horses and sharing stories about other city visitors who'd fallen in love with ranch life. "Jake's a good teacher," Emma said, refilling Sarah's coffee cup. "Patient as the day is long. Some of these ranchers, they forget that not everyone grew up around animals. But Jake, he remembers what it's like to be new to something." Sarah glanced toward the kitchen where Jake was discussing the day's work with one of the ranch hands. There was something about him that invited trust, a steady competence that made her feel safe even in unfamiliar situations. She'd known him less than 24 hours, but already she felt more seen and understood than she had by people who'd known her for years. The rest of the week passed in a blur of new experiences. Jake taught her to ride, starting with gentle lessons in the paddock and gradually moving to longer rides across the ranch property. She learned to recognize different types of cattle, to understand the rhythms of ranch life, to read the weather and the behavior of the animals. Each day brought small victories and growing confidence. Sarah found herself waking before her alarm, eager to begin the morning's work. The physical demands of ranch life revealed strength she'd forgotten she possessed, and the wide spaces seemed to expand something inside her chest that had been compressed for too long. More significantly, she found herself falling into easy friendship with Jake. He listened when she talked about her work at the school, asking thoughtful questions about the children she taught and the satisfaction she found in helping them discover their love of reading. He shared stories about the ranch, about growing up in this landscape, about the challenges and rewards of working with animals and land. "You ever think about doing something different?" Sarah asked one evening as they sat on the lodge porch, watching the sun set. Jake considered the question seriously. "Every job has hard days, but this life, it suits me. I like being responsible for things that matter. I like work that changes with the seasons, and I like the honesty of it. Animals don't pretend to be something they're not." That sounds peaceful. It is, but it's also lonely sometimes. He glanced at her. "What about you? You ever think about changing your life?" "I used to. When I was younger, I had all sorts of plans. Travel, adventure, maybe living somewhere completely different. But then life just settled into a pattern, and everyone kept telling me that pattern wasn't enough. Maybe the pattern's fine, and it's the people judging it who have the problem." Sarah looked at him in surprise. "That's not what most people would say." "I'm not most people." Jake's smile was gentle. "Besides, I've been watching you this week. You light up when you talk about your students, when you're working with the horses, when you're just sitting quiet watching the land. Doesn't look like an empty life to me." That night, Sarah lay in bed thinking about Jake's words. Tomorrow, her family would begin arriving, and with them would come all the familiar pressures and expectations. But something had shifted during her week at the ranch. For the first time in years, she felt grounded in her own worth, confident in the value of the life she'd built. She didn't know yet that Jake Thompson was already falling in love with the quiet librarian who'd approached his horses with such gentle determination, who'd listened to his stories with genuine interest, who'd found joy in simple morning sunrises over grassland. She couldn't know that he'd spent the evening planning ways to extend her visit, hoping she might find reasons to return to the ranch even after the wedding was over. All Sarah knew was that for 1 week, she'd felt completely herself without apology or explanation. Whatever happened next, that feeling was worth protecting. The woman her family pitied had discovered something precious in the Montana grasslands. Not just peace, but the recognition that she was already complete exactly as she was. As sleep finally took her, Sarah smiled into the darkness. Tomorrow would bring challenges, but tonight she was exactly where she belonged. The sound of multiple car engines crunching up the gravel drive jolted Sarah from her peaceful morning routine. She'd been helping Jake move a small group of horses to a different pasture, something that had become as natural as breathing during her week at the ranch. Now, watching the convoy of rental cars and SUVs approaching the lodge, she felt her stomach tighten with familiar anxiety. "The invasion begins," she murmured, brushing dust from her jeans. Jake looked up from securing the pasture gate, following her gaze to the arriving vehicles. "That your family?" "Advance scouts. The main force arrives this afternoon." Sarah tried to keep her tone light, but Jake caught the tension underneath. He walked over to where she stood, close enough that she could smell the clean scent of soap and sunshine that seemed to cling to his skin. "You know, if you need a break from the festivities, there's always work to be done around here. Horses don't care about wedding schedules." The simple offer of refuge made Sarah's throat tight with gratitude. "You might regret saying that." "I doubt it." His smile was warm and steady, the same expression that had been gradually melting her defenses all week. "Go on, go greet your people. I'll be here when you need me." Sarah walked toward the lodge with growing dread. Her week of peace about to be shattered by well-meaning relatives who saw her contentment as resignation and her independence as loneliness. The first car disgorged Aunt Helen, Uncle Bob, and their grown daughter Jennifer, who immediately began exclaiming over the rustic setting in voices that carried across the yard. "Sarah, there you are!" Aunt Helen descended upon her with the kind of enthusiastic hug that felt more like a capture. "We were so worried when your mother said you'd come early. What have you been doing out here all by yourself?" "Learning about ranch life. It's been wonderful." "Oh, how educational." Helen's smile was the particular type reserved for activities she considered mildly eccentric, but harmless. "Well, you'll have plenty of company now. Jennifer's brought those darling photos of little Emma's first steps. You simply must see them." And so it began. Within an hour, the lodge was filled with Mitchell family members, all eager to catch up, share news, and subtly inventory Sarah's life for signs of progress or concerning stagnation. She found herself backed into conversational corners, fielding the same questions she'd answered at every family gathering for the past decade. "Still working at the school? That's nice, dear. But have you thought about something more challenging? No special gentleman friend yet? Sarah, you're not getting any younger. I saw the sweetest article about women who start families later in life. Miracles happen, you know." By lunch, Sarah's jaw ached from maintaining a polite smile. She'd forgotten how exhausting it was to have her entire existence examined and found wanting by people who genuinely believed they had her best interests at heart. When she escaped to the bathroom, she caught sight of herself in the mirror and barely recognized the tense, guarded woman staring back. "There you are." Her sister Linda appeared in the doorway. "I've been looking for you everywhere. Mom wants to take family photos before the light gets harsh." Sarah followed Linda back to the main room, where their mother was organizing cousins and spouses into groups, while a professional photographer adjusted his equipment. The scene was achingly familiar, another family event where Sarah would be positioned on the end of group shots, the single daughter whose presence served as a reminder of paths not taken. "Sarah, honey, stand next to Jennifer," their mother directed. "Maybe she can give you some tips about that new dating app she's been using." She's met some very promising men. As Sarah took her assigned position, she caught sight of Jake through the window, leading a group of horses across the yard with the easy confidence she'd come to admire. He looked up toward the lodge and their eyes met briefly through the glass. His slight nod felt like an anchor in the chaos of family expectations. The photography session lasted 2 hours. 2 hours of being posed and repositioned, of listening to relatives discuss her life in third person while she stood right there, of having her single status treated as both a problem to be solved and a curiosity to be examined. When it finally ended, Sarah felt hollowed out, all the confidence and self-acceptance she'd built during her ranch week drained away. Sarah. The voice belonged to her cousin Beth, the bride-to-be, who approached with a radiant smile and arms outstretched. I'm so glad you made it, and early, too. I heard you've been playing cowgirl all week. Beth's hug was genuine, filled with the slightly manic energy of a woman in the final stages of wedding planning. Unlike some of the other relatives, her interest felt real rather than judgmental. The ranch is beautiful, Sarah said. Thank you for choosing such an amazing place. Isn't it gorgeous? David fell in love with it immediately. There's something so romantic about all this wide-open space. Beth gestured toward the endless grassland visible through the windows. Speaking of romantic, I heard you've been getting riding lessons from the owner. Mom said he's quite handsome. Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks. Jake's been very helpful, teaching me about ranch life. Jake, is it? Beth's grin was knowing. Well, good for you. It's about time you had some fun. You worked too hard, Sarah. You deserve someone who appreciates how wonderful you are. It was the first comment from a family member that didn't come loaded with criticism or concern, and Sarah felt dangerously close to tears. Thank you, Beth. That means a lot. I mean it. You've always been the kindest person in our family, the one everyone goes to when they need someone who really listens. I know everyone worries about you being alone, but honestly, you seem happier than most of the married people I know. Maybe they should worry about their own lives instead. Before Sarah could respond, Beth was pulled away by her maid of honor to handle some crisis with the florist. But her words lingered, creating a warm spot in Sarah's chest that helped counter the afternoon's accumulated damage. The rest of the day passed in a blur of wedding preparations and family obligations. Sarah helped with decorations, listened to toasts being rehearsed, and endured countless conversations about her life choices. By dinner time, she felt like she was wearing a mask, performing the role of dutiful daughter and sister, while her real self retreated somewhere safe and protected. Jake appeared in the dining room as the family was finishing their meal, hat in hand and boots clean but obviously fresh from outdoor work. Emma had called him in to meet the guests and discuss the next day's activities. Sarah watched him navigate the room full of strangers with the same calm presence he brought to everything, answering questions about the ranch and the wedding plans with patient courtesy. And you're the one who's been teaching our Sarah about ranch life, Aunt Helen said, her voice carrying that particular tone adults use when discussing a child's cute but temporary hobby. How lovely that she's found something to occupy her time. Sarah's a natural with the horses, Jake replied, his eyes finding Sarah across the room. Best student I've had in years. She's got good instincts and a gentle way that the animals respond to. Well, isn't that nice? Helen continued, clearly unimpressed by agricultural skills. Of course, Sarah's always been good with simple things. The dismissal was subtle but unmistakable, and Sarah felt the familiar burn of embarrassment. But instead of the apologetic smile she usually wore in such moments, she found herself watching Jake's reaction. His expression didn't change, but something shifted in his posture, a slight straightening that suggested he'd heard the insult clearly. There's nothing simple about working with horses, Jake said, his voice still pleasant but carrying a new edge. It requires intelligence, patience, and the kind of emotional awareness that not everyone possesses. Sarah has all three in abundance. The quiet conviction in his voice silenced the table for a moment. Sarah stared at him in amazement, not just for the defense, but for the way he'd spoken about her, like someone whose qualities he'd observed carefully and genuinely admired. Yes, well, Helen recovered quickly. It's wonderful that Sarah's found a hobby that suits her. Jake's smile was polite and sharp. With respect, ma'am, I wouldn't call it a hobby. Sarah's developed real skill this week. Given time, she could become an excellent horsewoman. The conversation moved on to other topics, but Sarah remained frozen in wonder. No one had ever defended her like that, so matter-of-factly and without apology. Jake continued to circulate among the family members, but every few minutes his eyes would find hers across the room, offering silent support that felt like a lifeline. Later that evening, as the family settled in for what her mother called quality time together, Sarah slipped out onto the lodge's back porch. The night air was cool and clean, filled with the sounds of crickets and the distant movement of cattle. She breathed deeply, trying to reclaim some of the peace that had been stripped away by hours of loving but relentless family attention. Rough day? She turned to find Jake approaching from the direction of the barn, his work finished for the day. In the dim light from the porch, he looked solid and reassuring, like something permanent in a world that suddenly felt very unstable. Is it that obvious? Only to someone who's been watching. He leaned against the porch railing beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. Want to talk about it? Sarah was quiet for a long moment, struggling to put her feelings into words. They love me, she said finally. I know they do, but sometimes love feels like being measured against a standard you'll never meet. What standard is that? The one where a woman's worth is measured by whether someone chose her, where contentment is seen as settling, and independence is just loneliness in disguise. The words came out more bitter than she'd intended. Jake was quiet, letting her speak without rushing to offer solutions or platitudes. I know they mean well, Sarah continued. They want me to be happy. But their version of happiness looks nothing like mine. When I try to tell them I am happy, they act like I'm lying to myself or making excuses. Are you? Lying to yourself, I mean? The question was gentle but direct, asked without judgment but expecting honesty. Sarah considered it seriously, thinking about her life before this week, about the quiet satisfaction she found in her work, the peace of her small apartment, the books she read, and the small pleasures that filled her days. No, she said finally. I mean, I get lonely sometimes. Everyone does. But I'm not miserable. I like my life. I like who I am when I'm living it. Then they're wrong. Jake's voice was matter-of-fact. Not about loving you. Anyone can see they care. But about measuring your happiness by their standards. You really think that? Sarah, I've watched you this week. I've seen you laugh at Luna's silly behavior, seen you take pride in learning something new, seen you find joy in a sunrise over the pasture. That's not what unhappiness looks like. In the darkness, Sarah felt tears threaten. Thank you for saying that and for what you did at dinner. No one's ever defended me like that before. That's a damn shame. There was anger in Jake's voice now, controlled but real. You deserve better than that. You deserve people who see your worth without needing to change you first. They stood in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the night sounds of the ranch. Sarah felt the tension of the day slowly leaving her shoulders, replaced by something warmer and more substantial. Jake, she said softly. Yes? What you said about me having time to become an excellent horsewoman, did you mean that, or were you just being kind? He turned to look at her directly, his face serious in the dim light. I meant it, but more than that, I meant what I said about your qualities. Intelligence, patience, emotional awareness. Those aren't just good for working with horses. They're good for living a meaningful life, regardless of how many people you share it with. The simple declaration hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that neither of them quite dared to examine directly. Sarah felt something shift in her chest, a door opening that she'd kept carefully locked for years. "I should get back inside," she said reluctantly. "Mom will worry." Of course. But Jake didn't move away from the railing, and neither did she. "Will you still have time for riding lessons tomorrow, with all the wedding chaos?" "I'll make time." His voice was soft but certain. "Early morning, before your family's awake?" "I'd like that." "Good. Luna will be disappointed if her favorite student doesn't show up." Sarah smiled in the darkness. "Her favorite student? Well, you're definitely mine." The words were spoken lightly, but something in Jake's tone made Sarah's breath catch. She looked at him more closely, trying to read his expression in the dim light from the porch. What she saw there made her pulse quicken, a warmth and intensity that went beyond casual instructor fondness. "Sarah," he said quietly, "I need you to know something." Before he could continue, the porch door opened, and Linda appeared, backlit by the warm glow from inside. "There you are. We're about to play charades, and Mom specifically requested your participation. You know how she gets when family traditions are threatened." The moment broken, Sarah and Jake stepped apart. "I'll be right there," Sarah called. "5 minutes," Linda warned before disappearing back inside. Jake pushed away from the railing. The spell of intimacy dissolved but not forgotten. "Go on, enjoy your family time. What were you going to say?" He paused, studying her face. "Another time, when we have more than 5 minutes and less chance of interruption." Sarah nodded, though every instinct urged her to stay, to push past her family's expectations and hear whatever Jake had been about to reveal. Instead, she went inside to play charades and pretend her world wasn't shifting on its axis because of a rancher who saw value in all the things her family considered shortcomings. The game lasted until nearly midnight, filled with laughter and good-natured arguments about rules. Sarah participated with what felt like genuine enjoyment, bolstered by Jake's words and the memory of how he'd defended her earlier. When Aunt Helen made another casual comment about Sarah's simple pleasures, Sarah found herself responding with more confidence than usual. "Actually, I've discovered I really enjoy learning new skills. This week has taught me I'm more capable than I thought." It wasn't a dramatic declaration, but it represented a shift, from apologizing for her interests to claiming them with quiet pride. Several family members looked surprised, as if they'd never heard Sarah speak about herself with such certainty. Later, as Sarah finally settled into her cabin for the night, she replayed the evening's conversations. Tomorrow would bring the rehearsal dinner and another day of family scrutiny, but something had changed. Jake's defense of her, his clear-eyed assessment of her worth, had given her a foundation to stand on that felt more solid than any she'd built before. More than that, the unfinished conversation on the porch had revealed feelings on both sides that neither had fully acknowledged before tonight. The way Jake had looked at her, the carefully controlled emotion in his voice when he'd spoken about what she deserved, it all pointed to something deeper than friendship developing between them. As Sarah drifted toward sleep, she thought about Jake's words. "You deserve people who see your worth without needing to change you first." For most of her adult life, she'd believed such people were rare, perhaps non-existent. The possibility that she'd found one, here in this unexpected place, filled her with a hope she'd almost forgotten how to feel. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight she fell asleep thinking not about her family's concerns, but about sunrise riding lessons and the quiet strength of a man who saw her exactly as she was and found her worthy of defense. The woman her relatives pitied was beginning to understand that their pity said more about their limitations than hers. The wedding was still 2 days away, but Sarah's real transformation had already begun. In a few short days, She'd discovered not just her own strength, but the extraordinary feeling of being truly seen and valued by someone whose opinion mattered more with each passing hour. Jake Thompson was changing her life not by trying to fix what others saw as broken, but by helping her recognize the completeness she'd possessed all along. The morning of the rehearsal dinner dawned gray and windy, with clouds building on the horizon that threatened the outdoor ceremony planned for the following day. Sarah woke before her alarm, as had become her custom during the ranch week, and dressed quietly for what might be her last riding lesson with Jake. The thought brought an unexpected pang of loss that went beyond simply leaving the ranch. She found Jake in the barn earlier than usual, checking weather forecasts on his phone while Luna stood patiently in the cross ties. His expression was troubled, the easy confidence she'd grown accustomed to replaced by genuine concern. "Bad news?" she asked, approaching with the quiet step she'd learned around the horses. "Potentially. Storm's moving in faster than predicted. We might need to move tomorrow's ceremony inside, which means rearranging everything your cousins planned." He looked up from the phone, his face softening when he saw her. "But we've got a couple hours before it hits. Still want that lesson?" "More than ever." They saddled Luna quickly, Jake's movements efficient but gentle as always. Sarah had learned to help with the process, taking pride in her growing competence with buckles and straps that had seemed impossibly complicated just days ago. Working alongside Jake in the quiet barn felt natural now, their movements synchronized in a way that spoke of shared purpose. "Where to today?" Sarah asked as they led Luna into the gray morning. "Thought we'd ride out to the high pasture. Best view of the ranch, and you should see it before you leave." Jake's voice was carefully neutral, but Sarah caught the underlying emotion. He was feeling the approaching goodbye, too. They rode in comfortable silence across the grassland, Luna responding to Sarah's guidance with the trust that still amazed her. The wind carried the scent of approaching rain and made the grass ripple like water around them. Despite the threatening weather, or perhaps because of it, the landscape felt more dramatic than ever, charged with energy that seemed to mirror the tension building between them. The high pasture lived up to its promise. From the slight rise, Sarah could see the entire ranch spread below them, the buildings looking small and sturdy against the vast landscape, cattle dotting the distant fields like dark punctuation marks, the winding creek catching what little light filtered through the clouds. It was beautiful in a way that made her chest tight with emotions she couldn't name. "It's incredible," she said, dismounting to stand beside Jake as they let the horses graze. "Been coming up here since I was a kid. When things get overwhelming down there, this perspective helps. Makes you remember what actually matters." Jake's eyes weren't on the view, but on her face. "Sarah, about what I started to say last night. You don't have to explain anything. I know this week has been unusual circumstances. And tomorrow I go back to my real life. I understand that." "Do you?" Jake stepped closer, close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes. "Because I'm not sure you understand at all." Before she could ask what he meant, the first fat raindrops began to fall. Jake looked up at the darkening sky and swore softly under his breath. "We need to get back. This is about to get serious." They rode back to the ranch at a pace just short of dangerous, reaching the barn as the storm opened up in earnest. Jake helped Sarah down from Luna, his hands lingering at her waist longer than necessary, and they worked together to get the horses settled and dry. The barn felt like a refuge, warm and dimly lit while rain drummed on the roof with increasing intensity. "Storm's going to last most of the day," Jake said, checking his phone again. "Your cousin's rehearsal dinner might need to move inside, too." "Beth will be devastated. She had her heart set on the outdoor ceremony. Emma's already working on backup plans. We've done this before. Mother Nature doesn't care about human schedules." Jake hung up Luna's bridle with practiced movements, but Sarah could sense tension in the set of his shoulders. "Jake, what's wrong? Besides the weather, I mean." He turned to face her fully, and the expression on his face made her breath catch. There was something raw and unguarded there, emotions held carefully in check for days finally threatening to break free. "What's wrong is that you're leaving tomorrow and I haven't had the courage to say what I should have said days ago." "Which is?" "That this week hasn't been unusual circumstances for me. That watching you discover your strength, seeing you light up when you accomplish something new, listening to you defend yourself to your family last night, none of that feels temporary or casual." Jake's voice was quiet but steady, each word chosen carefully. "What feels temporary is the time we have left, and I hate it." Sarah stared at him, hardly daring to breathe. "Jake, I know this is crazy. I know you have a life to get back to, a job, obligations. I know your family would probably think I'm taking advantage of some kind of ranch vacation fantasy." He ran a hand through his hair, leaving it disheveled. "But I also know that what I feel for you is real and what you've become here, this confident, capable woman who's not afraid to try new things. That's who you really are. Not the apologetic person your family seems to expect." The barn was quiet, except for the sound of rain and the gentle movement of horses in their stalls. Sarah felt as if the ground had shifted beneath her feet, leaving her balanced on the edge of possibilities she'd never dared imagine. "You think I'm confident?" Jake's laugh was soft and incredulous. "Sarah, you faced down a 1,200-pound horse on your first day. You've learned to ride in a week. You stood up to your aunt last night when she dismissed your accomplishments. If that's not confidence, I don't know what is." "I don't feel confident. Most of the time, I feel like I'm pretending to be someone braver than I really am." "Maybe that's what confidence actually is, doing what needs to be done even when you're scared." Rain continued to pound the roof above them, creating a cocoon of intimacy in the warm barn. Sarah thought about the woman she'd been when she arrived at the ranch, careful, apologetic, convinced her life was somehow insufficient. Then she thought about the woman she'd become over the course of a week, someone who could handle horses and defend her choices, and stand here listening to a good man declare his feelings without immediately assuming she wasn't worthy of them. "What are you asking me, Jake?" "I'm asking if what you've found here is worth considering a change. Not just the ranch, though God knows there's plenty of room for you here if you wanted it. I'm asking if what we've found together is real enough to explore, even though it's complicated and your family won't understand, and it means taking a risk on something that might not work." The words hung in the air between them, loaded with hope and possibility and the weight of a decision that would change everything. Sarah looked into Jake's face, seeing not just the man who'd taught her to ride and defended her worth, but someone who saw her completely and loved what he saw. "My family will think I've lost my mind," she said quietly. "Probably. They'll say I'm having some kind of midlife crisis, throwing away my stable life for a fantasy. They might. They'll worry that I'm making a mistake, rushing into something because I'm desperate or lonely or deluding myself." Jake's expression was steady and patient. "Are you? Desperate or lonely or deluding yourself?" Sarah considered the question seriously. Was she? Or was she simply, for the first time in years, allowing herself to want something without first calculating whether she deserved it? "No," she said finally. "I'm not desperate. I'm not even particularly lonely anymore. And if I'm deluding myself, it's about thinking I'm not brave enough to choose happiness over other people's expectations. And what would make you happy, Sarah?" She looked at him, really looked at him, taking in the weathered hands that had guided hers on the reins, the patient eyes that had watched her struggles without judgment, the steady presence that had made her feel safe enough to discover her own strength. "This," she said simply, "you, this life, the chance to keep becoming whoever I am when I'm here." Jake's smile started slow and spread until it transformed his whole face. Is that a yes to exploring possibilities? That's a yes to more than possibilities. Sarah stepped closer, close enough to reach up and touch his face, feeling the scratch of stubble under her palm. That's a yes to hoping this is just the beginning. When Jake kissed her, it was with the careful reverence of someone who understood the gift he'd been given. Sarah kissed him back with all the confidence she'd discovered during her week at the ranch. No longer the woman who apologized for taking up space, but someone who knew her own worth and wasn't afraid to claim it. The storm raged outside, but inside the barn, surrounded by the gentle sounds of horses and rain, Sarah Mitchell finally understood what it felt like to be cherished exactly as she was. The rehearsal dinner that evening was moved inside the lodge, candles flickering on tables, while wind rattled the windows and rain continued its steady assault. Despite the change in plans, Beth was radiant, her joy infectious enough to lift the spirits of even the most weather-concerned guests. Sarah sat with her family, but for the first time in memory, their questions and comments seemed to bounce off her without leaving marks. When Aunt Helen asked if she'd given any more thought to making some changes in her life, Sarah smiled and said she was considering several exciting possibilities. "What kind of possibilities?" her mother asked, with the careful hope of someone who'd been disappointed before. "I'm thinking about exploring a different kind of life, something that makes better use of skills I've discovered I have." The vague answer clearly frustrated her relatives, but Sarah found she didn't care. Tomorrow, after the wedding, she'd have real conversations with them about her decisions. Tonight, she was content to keep her happiness close and protected. Jake appeared periodically throughout the evening, checking on the weather updates and coordinating with Emma about contingency plans. Each time their eyes met across the room, Sarah felt a jolt of connection that was becoming wonderfully familiar. Once, when he paused by her table to update the family on tomorrow's arrangements, his hand briefly touched her shoulder, a small gesture that nevertheless announced to anyone paying attention that something significant had shifted between them. "Sarah." Beth caught her during a lull in the festivities, pulling her aside for a private conversation. "I have to ask, what's going on with you and the rancher? You're practically glowing." Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks. "Is it that obvious?" "To someone who knows you?" "Absolutely. You look different, confident, happy in a way I don't think I've seen before." Beth's expression was delighted. "Please tell me this isn't just a vacation fling." "It's not," Sarah said, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. "It's something real, something worth exploring. Good for you. Mom mentioned you've seemed happier here than she's seen you in years. Maybe this place brings out the best in you. Maybe it brings out who I really am." "Even better." Beth hugged her warmly. "I'm so happy for you, Sarah. You deserve someone who sees how wonderful you are." The next morning dawned clear and brilliant, as if the storm had washed the world clean overnight. Sarah woke early and walked to her cabin window, looking out over the sparkling grassland where puddles caught the morning light like scattered jewels. The transformation was dramatic, from yesterday's gray drama to today's crystal clarity. The wedding preparations began early, with Emma coordinating a small army of vendors and family members to restore the outdoor ceremony setup. Sarah helped where she could, but mostly she watched the controlled chaos with amusement, thinking about how different her priorities had become in just over a week. "You're very quiet today," her mother observed as they arranged flowers on reception tables. "Having second thoughts about coming early? I know it's been a long time away from home." "Actually, I've been thinking it hasn't been long enough." Her mother's hands stilled on the flower stems. "What do you mean?" Sarah took a deep breath, recognizing the moment she'd been unconsciously preparing for all week. I'm thinking about making some changes, significant ones. What kind of changes? The kind where I stop living my life according to other people's expectations and start living it according to my own. Her mother's expression was carefully neutral, the look she wore when trying not to influence a conversation she desperately wanted to control. That sounds very abstract, honey. Are we talking about specific changes? We're talking about me possibly relocating, possibly changing careers, definitely changing my perspective on what constitutes a successful life. Relocating where? Sarah gestured toward the ranch spread out around them. Here, maybe. Or somewhere like here. The silence that followed was loaded with unspoken concerns and barely contained objections. Sarah could practically hear her mother's mental gears turning, searching for the right approach to talk her daughter back to sensibility. Sarah, sweetheart, I know this place is lovely for a vacation, but you can't make major life decisions based on a week of playing cowgirl. What about your job? Your apartment? Your whole life is in Cedar Falls. Is it? Or is it just the place where I've been marking time, living the life everyone expected me to live instead of the one I wanted? But honey, this is so sudden. You've never shown any interest in rural life before. Sarah smiled, thinking about Luna's warm breath on her hands, about sunrise rides across endless grassland, about the satisfaction of work that engaged both her body and mind. Maybe I've never had the chance to discover what I was interested in before. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of the wedding photographer, but Sarah could see her mother filing away every word for later analysis and concern. The next few hours would be difficult, she knew, filled with family meetings and gentle interventions designed to save her from what they'd see as a spectacular mistake. But as Sarah helped with the final wedding preparations, watching Beth's radiant happiness and feeling her own quiet joy building in her chest, she found herself remarkably calm about the coming confrontations. For the first time in her adult life, she knew exactly who she was and what she wanted. That clarity was worth defending. The wedding ceremony itself was perfect, Beth and David exchanging vows under an arch of white roses, while the Montana sky provided a backdrop of infinite blue. Sarah watched the familiar ritual with new eyes, thinking not about her own single status as she always had before, but about the courage it took to choose love openly, to declare your commitment in front of everyone who mattered. When the officiant asked for the rings, and Beth's nephew carefully carried them forward, Sarah caught sight of Jake standing at the back of the assembled guests. He wasn't part of the ceremony, but Emma had invited him to watch, and he'd cleaned up impressively for the occasion. Their eyes met across the crowd, and he smiled at her with such warmth that several relatives turned to see what had captured her attention. During the reception, as toasts were made and dancing began, Sarah found herself surrounded by family members eager to discuss her earlier comments about relocating. The conversations were loving but persistent, filled with practical concerns and emotional appeals. Sarah, you can't just abandon your whole life for someone you've known a week, Linda said during one particularly intense sisterly intervention. I'm not abandoning anything. I'm choosing something. But what about stability? Security? Your retirement account, for heaven's sake? What about happiness? What about living authentically? What about taking a chance on something that could be extraordinary instead of settling for something that's merely safe? The questions seemed to genuinely surprise her family, as if they'd never considered that Sarah might have been settling rather than simply being content. Their concern was real, but so was their inability to see beyond their own definitions of success and security. The intervention might have continued indefinitely, but Jake appeared at Sarah's elbow during a brief lull in the family offensive. Mind if I steal her for a dance? He asked politely, though his tone suggested he wasn't really asking permission. Sarah's relatives could hardly object without being openly rude. So they stepped aside as Jake led her onto the makeshift dance floor. Other couples swayed to the slow music under string lights that twinkled like stars, but Sarah was aware only of Jake's arms around her and the steady beat of his heart under her palm. "Rescue mission successful," she murmured against his chest. "You looked like you needed backup. How are you holding up?" "Better than expected. It's easier to defend decisions when you're sure they're right." "Are you sure?" Sarah leaned back to look at his face, seeing her own certainty reflected in his eyes. "I'm sure that I want to find out what happens next. I'm sure that I've been happier this week than I've been in years. And I'm sure that walking away from this would be the biggest mistake I could make. Even if your family never understands, they'll understand eventually. And if they don't, that's their choice. I can't live my life trying to meet other people's expectations anymore." Jake spun her gently, bringing her back into his arms with a smile that lit up his whole face. "In that case, I have a question for you." "Only one?" "For now. What are you doing next Friday?" "Why?" "Because I know a librarian who'd be perfect for the job opening at Cedar Falls Elementary. If she was interested in staying in the area while she figures out what comes next." Sarah's breath caught. "Are you serious?" "Emma made some calls. Turns out the school librarian is retiring next month, and they're desperate for someone with your qualifications. It's not permanent, just a contract position to finish out the year. But it would give you time to decide what you really want without having to choose everything all at once." The offer was perfect. A bridge between her old life and whatever came next. A way to explore possibilities without burning every bridge behind her. But more than that, it was evidence of how carefully Jake had been thinking about their future. How seriously he took her need to choose, rather than simply be chosen. "You've been planning this. I've been hoping for it. There's a difference." Jake's voice was soft, but sure. "I meant what I said about giving you space to discover who you are here. But I also meant what I said about wanting to explore this together." Around them, the wedding celebration continued. But Sarah felt as if she and Jake existed in their own private bubble of possibility. The life she'd been living felt suddenly small and distant, a black and white photograph compared to the technicolor reality of this moment. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes to the job. Yes to the job. Yes to staying. Yes to taking a chance on something extraordinary." Sarah reached up to touch his face, no longer caring who might be watching. "Yes to you, Jake Thompson. Yes to finding out what happens when I stop apologizing for who I am and start celebrating it instead." When he kissed her there on the dance floor, with her family watching and string lights twinkling overhead and the vast Montana sky stretching endlessly above them, Sarah felt like she was finally completely home. 6 months later, Sarah stood in the same high pasture where Jake had first declared his feelings, watching the sunrise paint the grassland gold. Luna stood beside her, patient and warm in the morning chill, while Sarah sipped coffee from a thermos and planned her day. She'd been living at the ranch for 3 months now, her teaching contract successfully completed, and a new life gradually taking shape around her. The transition hadn't been without challenges. Her family had needed time to accept her decision, and there had been difficult conversations about disappointment and worry and the fear that she was throwing away security for fantasy. But gradually, as they saw her genuine happiness, their concern had shifted to cautious support. More importantly, Sarah had needed time to trust her own transformation, to believe that the confident, capable woman she'd become wasn't just a temporary vacation personality, but her true self finally given room to flourish. Working with the horses daily, helping Jake manage the ranch, teaching riding lessons to guests, all of it had confirmed what she'd sensed that first week. This life suited her in ways she'd never dared hope for. "You're up early, even for you," Jake's voice came from behind her, warm with affection and the slight rasp of sleep. She turned to find him approaching with his own coffee, dark hair disheveled and work clothes already in place despite the early hour. Couldn't sleep. Too excited about today. The new guests? That, and other things. Sarah smiled, thinking about the letter in her pocket, the one she'd been carrying around for 2 days while she decided how to share its contents. Jake settled beside her on the blanket she'd spread on the ground, close enough that their shoulders touched. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun climb higher and listening to the gentle sounds of the ranch waking up around them. "Jake," Sarah said finally, "I got a letter from Beth yesterday." "Good news, I hope." "The best. She's pregnant, due in the fall." Jake glanced at her, studying her expression carefully. "How do you feel about that?" It was exactly the right question, asked without assumption or judgment. Sarah considered her answer honestly, probing for the familiar ache of envy or longing that had always accompanied news of other women's pregnancies. To her surprise, she found only genuine joy for her cousin and a deep sense of peace about her own path. "I feel happy for her, really, truly happy, without any of the complicated feelings I used to have." Sarah leaned against Jake's shoulder. "I used to think there was something wrong with me for not wanting that life desperately enough to make it happen. But now I think maybe there was something wrong with believing there was only one way to live fully. And now I think I'm living exactly the life I was meant to live. Maybe not the one my family expected, maybe not the conventional choice, but the right one for me." Jake's arm came around her shoulders, solid and warm and reassuring. "I love that you know that now. That certainty. It's one of the things I admire most about who you've become. Who I've become, or who I always was underneath. Both. You were always this strong, this capable. But now you believe it too." They sat watching the sunrise slowly transform the landscape, comfortable in the silence and in each other's presence. Sarah thought about the woman she'd been a year ago, apologizing for her choices and wondering if her life had meaning. That woman felt like someone she'd known long ago, before she learned to see herself through eyes that loved rather than judged. "Sarah," Jake said quietly, "I have something I want to ask you." "What's that?" Instead of answering, he shifted on the blanket, reaching into his jacket pocket. When his hand emerged, it held a small velvet box that made Sarah's heart stop completely. "I know this might seem fast to some people. I know your family might have opinions about the timeline." Jake's voice was steady, but she could see the vulnerability in his eyes. "But I also know that when something is right, it's right. And this, you and me, this life we're building together, it's the rightest thing I've ever found." Sarah stared at the ring box, her mind reeling. Part of her wanted to point out all the practical concerns. They'd known each other less than a year. They were still figuring out the logistics of their combined life. Her family would definitely have opinions about the speed of their courtship. But a larger part of her, the part that had learned to trust her instincts over other people's expectations, felt only joy and certainty. "Jake Thompson," she said softly, "are you proposing to me at sunrise on a Montana mountainside?" "I'm proposing to you in the place where we both figured out who we really are. The place where you taught me that love isn't about changing someone to fit your expectations, but about celebrating who they already are." He opened the box, revealing a simple but beautiful ring that caught the morning light. "Sarah Mitchell, will you marry me? Will you keep building this extraordinary life with me?" The answer came without hesitation, rising from the same place of certainty that had guided all her best decisions this year. "Yes. Absolutely. Completely yes." When Jake slipped the ring onto her finger, Sarah felt the final piece of her transformation click into place. She was no longer the woman her family pitied for her empty life. no longer the person who apologized for taking up space. She was Sarah Mitchell, who'd found courage enough to choose happiness over convention, who'd discovered that love came not from being needed, but from being truly seen and valued. As Jake kissed her there in the high pasture, with Luna grazing nearby and the vast Montana sky stretching endlessly above them, Sarah understood finally what it meant to be complete. Not because a man had chosen her, but because she'd chosen herself, and found someone who celebrated that choice wholeheartedly. The woman judged childless by her kin had found something far more valuable than their approval. She'd found a love that saw her worth exactly as she was, and the courage to build a life that honored her true self rather than others' expectations. In choosing Jake and this unconventional path, she'd discovered that the most profound kind of fulfillment came not from fitting into predetermined roles, but from creating a life authentic enough to make her grateful for every sunrise. Their wedding 6 months later was small and perfect, held at the ranch with only the people who truly mattered in attendance. Sarah's family came, and though some still harbored concerns about the speed of the courtship and the unconventional nature of her new life, they could no longer deny her obvious happiness. Watching their daughter exchange vows with the rancher who looked at her like she hung the stars, even her most skeptical relatives began to understand that conventional timelines mattered less than genuine connection. As they danced under the same string lights where they'd first kissed, Sarah felt the profound satisfaction of a life chosen rather than simply accepted. She'd learned that happiness came not from meeting others' expectations, but from having the courage to exceed her own. And in Jake's arms, surrounded by the endless Montana landscape that had taught her to see herself clearly, Sarah Mitchell Thompson knew she'd found something worth more than approval or conventional success. She'd found home.